Thank you for coming out on a Saturday morning. I am not a morning person myself, so I will try to make this worth your while. We are going to be talking about hyperinsulinemia as a major driver of chronic illness, especially like all the chronic metabolic diseases that so many people are dealing with now. And just to parse that out, hyperinsulinemia is just a big word that means insulin is too high in the blood. Hyper, high, insulin. Insulinemia in the blood. Hyperinsulinemia means you have too much insulin in your blood. Slide, please. So when we talk about metabolic disease, metabolic syndrome, we tend to really hear or think of two things, right? Type 2 diabetes and obesity. And they go hand in hand so often that they even have the phrase now, diabesity, right? You've probably heard diabesity. But we know for certain that not everybody who is overweight has type 2 diabetes, and there's plenty of thin people who are not overweight that do have type 2 diabetes. So they don't always go hand in hand, but they travel together enough that we have this word diabesity. But here we are. It might be hard to see, but we have our happy little cruise ship coming through these two huge, scary icebergs of type 2 and obesity. But there's plenty of room. We're coming through, no problem. Safe sailing, smooth seas ahead. Slide. Now, what's up with all this? We just came through. It was just clear sailing, and now we got to navigate all this junk. This is really scary. What if I told you that every single illness listed on this slide is either caused by or made worse by chronically high insulin? So we are not just talking about type 2 diabetes and obesity anymore. We're talking about hypertension and cardiovascular disease and gout and PCOS and enlarged prostate gland. We're talking about erectile dysfunction. We're talking about Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, possibly cancer. I'll talk about that a little bit later. But all of these can be tied in some way to chronically high insulin. Next slide. So I think, is there a way, there's animations in my slides, are we not able to have those animations? I don't know. That's okay. So, all right, stuff is just going to look a little different than it normally looks. Why would all that stuff be tied to insulin? Insulin's a blood sugar hormone, right? That's what it does. It lowers blood sugar. What does it have to do with blood pressure? What does it have to do with erectile dysfunction? What does it have to do with brain function? This is a blood sugar hormone. Now, can somebody name me some other hormones? What are other hormones? Testosterone, estrogen, cortisol. I like to use estrogen as an example because why is it that, estrogen is a menstrual cycle hormone, right? It's a female reproductive type hormone. So why is it that after menopause, when estrogen kind of tanks, why is it that a woman's risk for cardiovascular disease skyrockets, osteoporosis risk skyrockets, all this stuff happens? Estrogen is a menstrual cycle hormone. What? Because estrogen has many, many different functions. It doesn't just regulate the menstrual cycle. I don't know of any hormone that only has one job. Most hormones have a zillion jobs in all different kinds of tissues in the body. Insulin is no different. Insulin does lower blood sugar, but it has effects in almost every single gland, organ, and tissue you can think of. There's almost nothing that is not influenced by insulin in some way. Slide, please. So it's kind of hard to see here. It's a little bit small, but we have papers where they call hyperinsulinemia a unifying theory of chronic disease and hyperinsulinemic diseases of civilization, more than just Syndrome X. Syndrome X is the old name for what we now call metabolic syndrome. They didn't know what was causing it. It was this X factor that tied all these weird symptoms together, so they called it Syndrome X. When they found out that the X factor was chronically high insulin, some doctors, some researchers started calling it insulin-resistant syndrome. We call it metabolic syndrome today. I wish we still called it insulin-resistant syndrome. I wish even more that we called it chronically high insulin syndrome or hyperinsulinemic syndrome, because metabolic syndrome, what does that even mean? What is metabolism? Insulin resistance syndrome is even worse. Nobody agrees, even the experts, nobody agrees what insulin resistance is or what it means. Let's call it what it is, chronically high insulin syndrome. That tells you right there what it is and what to do about it. All your problems are coming from chronically high insulin, lower insulin. There's a lot of different ways to do that, but that's what you would have to do. Slide, please. So, insulin is definitely far, far, far more than just a blood sugar hormone. If this whole thing is about insulin and the nefarious trouble that it can get into, what does insulin do? Well, I'm going to steal something from a lady named Diane Sanfilippo. Some of you may have heard of her. She's very well known in the paleo world. She said insulin is like your mom. Insulin likes to tidy things up. When there's junk all over your room, your mom's like, put it, I don't care where you put it, just get it off the floor, put it in the drawer, put it under the bed, put it in the closet, just get it out of sight. Your mom doesn't like stuff cluttering the room. Insulin does not like stuff cluttering the bloodstream. Insulin likes to take stuff out of the bloodstream and put it away somewhere else. The first thing it does is it takes glucose out of your blood and puts it where? In your liver, in your muscles, wherever it can find room for it. So insulin does lower blood sugar, of course it does. But let's remember, or maybe you might be learning for the first time, most glucose uptake into cells does not require insulin. Even without insulin, glucose can get into most cells just fine. So we know insulin is doing a lot more than that because that's really not even its main job. The other thing, or an other thing, that insulin likes to put away and get out of the bloodstream and shove someplace else is amino acids. This is why bodybuilders actually inject themselves with insulin. Can you imagine? Healthy, fit people injecting insulin so they can get swole, right? Because insulin pumps you up. But again, we don't always need insulin to do that. Amino acids can get into cells, but it's also one reason why a lot of athletes think that they need carbs after a workout, because that insulin spike is going to help pull that protein, or if they take like a protein shake, they'll take carbs with it. But you don't need the carbs to get the amino acids into the muscles. Protein can do that all by itself. That will make insulin do that. Insulin promotes cell or tissue growth. Insulin is an anabolic hormone. We all know this, right? We know insulin makes cells grow. Insulin makes the heck grow out of fat cells. Can I say H-E-C-K in a church? Sorry. There's a doctor named Ronald Hoffman who said the greatest thing. He said, insulin is like Miracle Grow for your fat cells. And it promotes aberrant tissue growth. I don't know if you saw on the slide with all the icebergs, I had skin tags on there. Insulin influences weird, uncontrolled, aberrant growth of stuff. Enlarges the prostate gland. It makes your fat cells bigger. It makes your muscle cells bigger. It makes cysts on your ovaries. We have PCOS, polycystic ovarian, the skin tags. Cancer. No, before anyone gets the wrong idea, I'm not saying that insulin causes cancer. But what insulin does do, and what they have shown many times in the research, is that insulin kind of rolls out the red carpet to let cancer grow faster and better. Whatever is causing the cancer, if you have chronically high insulin, that cancer is growing to grow faster. It kind of enables the growth. So the other big thing, the thing I'm personally most concerned about, is that insulin inhibits lipolysis. Lipolysis just means the breaking down of fat. Lipo means fat, like lipids or liposuction. Lysis is breaking apart. If you want to burn fat, if you want to lose body fat, you want to burn dietary fat, whatever, you have to break the fat down so it can travel to other cells to be burned. Insulin directly inhibits this process. If you did not know that, it's a shame we don't have the animations because it was kind of cute, but oh well. If that's a shock to you, this is why it was so hard for so many of us to lose weight when we were eating all those whole grains and all those fat-free muffins and all that high-carb, low-fat stuff that they told us to eat. Because one person can eat a muffin and their insulin does this. I can eat a muffin and maybe my insulin does that. And maybe it stays like that for 4 hours. So insulin is directly antagonistic to us burning fat. Next slide, please. So insulin, think of insulin like a security guard that stands outside your fat cells. When insulin is blocking that fat from coming out, blocking the lipolysis, you ain't gonna lose fat. No way, no how, can't do it. So next cell, please. Next slide, not cell. I am the world's worst artist. If any of you read my blog or know of my work, I'm really a writer. There's a reason I'm not a designer. So this is not to scale. This is not a true, this is just for illustrative purposes here. Just know, this is a diagram of somebody eating 3 meals a day. On the top in the red, that's when your insulin is elevated and the fat storage is happening and fat burning is not happening. In the lower level with the green, that's when insulin is lower. When insulin is lower, the fat breaking down is not inhibited. The fat can come out, be released, be burned. So we have breakfast. Let's say somebody's eating a good, healthy breakfast. They're having, cereal with skim milk and maybe some fruit, maybe a piece of whole wheat toast with margarine, right? Their insulin is gonna kind of jack up a lot, but they're insulin sensitive, they're relatively healthy, it's going to come back down. And then let's say they spend a couple of hours before they eat lunch. So in between breakfast and lunch, they spend a little bit of time in the lower insulin zone. The fat's coming out, no problem. They have lunch, insulin comes up again, no big deal, it's going to come back down again by dinner. They have dinner, big spike again. Overnight, you're not eating, you go 8-10 hours without eating, maybe some of us only 5 or 6 hours. Whatever it is, you're gonna spend a little more time overnight in that low insulin period. Next slide. Here's an example of somebody eating 2 meals a day. They're probably gonna have bigger insulin rises because it's a larger meal. Even if you're eating like a low carb meal, the total amount of food is gonna affect your insulin. So first meal, again, a big spike, but you're going to spend even more time between meals because you're only eating twice a day. Maybe you're going several hours where you're in that bottom green portion, the insulin's low, you're burning fat, life is good. Big second meal, big insulin rise, but again, overnight, lots of fat burning happening. Next slide. Here's an example of somebody who is insulin resistant. Eating, again, a healthy, perfectly good, lowish fat, high carb diet, just like they told us to. Breakfast, again, maybe a fruit salad, some orange juice, some skim milk, some toast, some fat-free bran muffin. Your insulin skyrockets, right? And then you have to snack, right? You have to snack, you gotta keep that metabolism revved up. You gotta eat to keep your blood sugar up, right? How many times have we heard that? So you're having a snack. Your insulin doesn't even have time to come back to normal before you're snacking again. So it doesn't even come down, and we're raising it again. Maybe if you're lucky, you spend a teeny tiny bit of time before lunch in the fat burning zone, that tiny section of green. Then we're having lunch. Maybe we're having whole wheat bread with turkey and a side of like baked chips, not fried, because they're like lower in fat, Maybe you're having a smoothie, something fat-free, full of fruit. It's really good for you. So you're jacking up the insulin again. Then you've got to have your 3 or 4 o'clock snack. So again, insulin's not even coming back to normal before we're raising it again. Same thing with dinner. This poor person, this was me 10 years ago. This was maybe all of us a couple of months or years ago before we started eating differently. Doing exactly what we thought we wanted to do. We were awash in insulin all day. It's no wonder we couldn't lose weight, no matter how hard we exercised, no matter how much we prayed, no matter how much low-fat, fat-free food we ate. We could not lose weight. We probably even gained some. Next slide, please. So how are we going to fix this? We have to get rid of insulin, right? If insulin is blocking this fat burning, by God, we've got to get him out of there. Next slide. All right, here's an example of somebody doing a keto diet or a low-carb diet. For breakfast, we got insulin's barely budging, if it's budging at all, right? Because maybe we're having bacon and eggs, maybe we're having sausage, maybe we're having just coffee, maybe we're having coffee with our yummy Adapt shot in it. But insulin's barely moving. we spend a lot more time in the fat burning zone. Same thing with lunch and dinner. I only have a slightly larger insulin rise because those would be larger meals. You know, maybe you're going to have a larger portion of vegetables or something with dinner, but you can see that eating a low carb or keto diet, you spend so much more of your day in that green fat burning zone. That's where we want to be. When insulin is low, it's so much easier to burn fat. Next slide, please. So this is what I said before. We used to call, see, what we now call the there in the red, the Journal of Hypertension from 2006, so what, only 19 years ago, and not 19 years ago, 13 years ago, and the Journal of Hypertension. What is an article about metabolic syndrome or insulin resistance syndrome doing in a blood pressure journal? It's a blood sugar hormone. Next slide, please. Okay, see, this is the problem with the no animations. That's okay, I will walk you through this anyway, but my big punchline is already ruined. That's okay, that's okay. This is live, like we just roll with the punches here, we're good. When you're running on fat and you're running on ketones, you don't get that like these rages, you just roll with the punches, life is good, right? You stay very emotionally balanced, so you don't have to get upset over anything. So, the official diagnostic criteria for metabolic syndrome include 5 things. You don't have to have all 5. You have to have at least 3 or more or be taking medication for them. I should face this way too, I'm ignoring you people. I'm not ignoring, I'm right-handed. I think I just tend to look toward the right more. So, large waist circumference, that abdominal obesity, right, the apple shape. High triglycerides, low HDL, hypertension, high blood pressure, and elevated fasting glucose. Just as a point of fact here, do you see total cholesterol on that slide anywhere? Do you see LDL, bad cholesterol on that slide? No. You know why? Because nobody cares. No, it's not that nobody cares, it's that, believe it or not, your total cholesterol and your LDL tell you almost nothing about your risk for metabolic disease. The low HDL is a teller, and the high triglycerides, that combination is the big teller. Now, you already see the punchline, so I can't ask you what's missing. This is the official diagnostic criteria for metabolic syndrome, which we used to call insulin resistance syndrome. What is missing from the diagnostic criteria? Thank you. How are you going to diagnose insulin resistance syndrome when you don't even measure insulin? It's like diagnosing you with a broken leg when they haven't even looked at your leg. I don't know, or like they haven't even gotten an x-ray. Next slide. So, some of you might be familiar with this guy, Joseph Kraft. He wrote a book called Diabetes Epidemic in You. I recommend it. It's about this thick. You can read it in a day. He was a doctor that discovered, so something I have failed to mention is that when I'm talking about all this chronically high insulin stuff, we're talking about people whose blood sugar is normal. Your fasting glucose is normal, your A1C might even be normal, but your insulin is through the roof. So Dr. Kraft discovered this. He discovered all these people with super high insulin that had all these metabolic problems, but their blood sugar was normal, so no one ever even knew there was a problem. This is a quote from his book. The pathology of diabetes occurs in those with normal blood sugars. There are far too many who are told, don't worry, your fasting blood sugars are normal. Normal weight, normal BMI, normal fasting blood sugar, and even normal fasting insulin, we'll talk about that in a minute, do not exclude hyperinsulinemia or type 2 diabetes. Dr. Kraft thought they were the same thing. To him, hyperinsulinemia was type 2 diabetes. The blood sugar had nothing to do with it, it was the insulin. He coined the phrase diabetes in situ or occult diabetes. Occult means hidden. The diabetes, the high blood sugar, was hidden, masked by the high insulin. I have a friend named Tony who's like a walking example of this. Tony is a dear friend, but he's obese. And he has a really, really hard time losing weight. He doesn't understand why. His A1C was normal. The glucose was normal. His endocrinologist was clueless. I said, get a fasting insulin test. His fasting insulin was 32. If any of you know what the range is, that's really, really high. That was the big smoking gun. Why did the nutritionist have to tell him? The endocrinologist was like, I don't know. Anyway, Dr. Kraft, if you might know the three gentlemen down there in the bottom right. That's Dr. Kraft on the left, Dr. Jeff Gerber. He goes by Denver's Diet Doctor. We have a big low-carb event in Denver next month. They just opened up new tickets, so check that out. Google Low Carb Denver. And Ivor Cummins, who is very well-known online with keto and low carb. So Dr. Kraft pioneered something called what is now called the Kraft test. You guys know what the oral glucose tolerance test is? Where they make you drink this glucose and then they check your blood sugar at a couple of intervals. Dr. Kraft's Kraft test is an oral glucose tolerance test, but instead of only checking your blood glucose, they check the insulin at all those points too. And the standard glucose tolerance test is only 2 hours. Kraft extended it out to 5 hours. And by making those two seemingly small changes, he uncovered this massive, massive problem of people whose blood sugar throughout the whole test was totally normal, but their insulin was super high. So we're going to take a look at some of those. I think it's going to be ruined because we don't have the animations, but next slide, please. So yeah, can't even see the numbers. Is there any way to fix this? Like, why aren't those animations working? I don't know. Oh well. So there's something called HOMA-IR. Some of you might know what this is already, but it stands for Homeostatic Model Assessment of Insulin Resistance. Homeostasis means like keeping your body on an even keel. So what HOMA-IR does, the beauty of the HOMA-IR, is that it tells us the relationship between fasting glucose and insulin. The fasting glucose is really misleading, right? Because we have all these people with normal glucose that have high insulin. So HOMA-IR looks at both. HOMA-IR tells us how hard is the body working to keep us at homeostasis. How hard does our pancreas have to work? How much insulin does it have to pump out to keep the glucose normal? So you can't see the numbers now. I'll try to remember what they were. In person A, we have a fasting glucose of 96. In person B, we had a fasting glucose that I think I had 82 or 80 something on the slide. Now, 96 is not that high. You know, like if you have diabetes, you would love to have a fasting glucose of 96. In the keto world, there's a lot of like fear around a slightly elevated glucose. There's a lot of reasons why fasting glucose can be in the 90s or the low 100s, and it's really not a big deal. But that being said, if the only information we had about these two people, the only thing we knew was the fasting glucose, and we had one at 96 and one at 82, if you had to choose to be one of these people, you would probably want the 82. You'd want to have the lower blood glucose. But when we measure insulin, person A has a fasting insulin of 4 micro international units, whatever they use. Person B's insulin is like 16. Person B's pancreas has to pump out 4 times the insulin to keep the glucose at a normal level. While person A, their pancreas is like, oh, we're good, we don't really need that much insulin because we're healthy and we're insulin sensitive. So person A has a much, much, much lower HOMA-IR. Person B has a HOMA-IR, you can sort of see at 3.64. If you look at the numbers there, they are massively insulin resistant. That is a very sick person. They might be thin on the outside, they might feel okay, but they have a lot of crazy stuff going on the inside. If I have to choose between these two people now, I will gladly take a slightly higher blood sugar for a HOMA-IR that's so much lower.